There's a pattern I keep seeing, and it's not in people who give up on their practices or people who never really committed. It's in ones who went all in. Years of meditation, ceremony, retreats, journaling, shadow work. Everything that the spiritual community says you're supposed to do, and something still isn't moving. The same emotional loops, the same relational patterns, this background feeling of being stuck despite everything. I find that genuinely interesting, and the research on why it happens is honestly kind of unsettling. There is also something specific, a particular moment inside the practice itself, where this tends to happen without anyone noticing. I want to get to that. But first, what is spiritual bypassing actually? Because the term gets used a lot, and I think it's worth being precise about it. John Welwood was a psychologist working with meditation communities in the 1980s. He was one of the first Western therapists to take spiritual practice seriously as a clinical phenomenon. And what he kept noticing in people around him, in himself even, was that spiritual practice could be used to go around emotional pain rather than through it. He called it spiritual bypassing. The definition he gave is worth sitting with. The use of spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep unresolved emotional wounds. Not avoiding practice, using practice as a detour around the thing that needs attention. And what struck him, and what I find striking, is that it didn't feel like avoidance when you're in it. It feels like evolution. It feels like you're becoming someone who's above this. That's what makes it so difficult to study, because from the outside, and even from the inside, it looks almost identical to genuine growth. The difference is underneath it. Here's the part that gets interesting from a neuroscience perspective. Your mind is genuinely extraordinary at finding meaning. Something painful happens, and within seconds, the mind is already building a framework around it. I notice this in myself. Someone says something that triggers me, or I walk into a situation that's uncomfortable, and within seconds, my mind is already doing something with it. Like, this is karmic clearing, there's a lesson here, I'm not going to let this lower my vibration. And the thing is, none of that is wrong, necessarily. Those things might even be true, but I've noticed that the framework arrives so quickly and there's no space for anything else. No space for the thing itself to just be felt. And this is exactly what the research on trauma processing points to. Your nervous system isn't processing meaning. It's processing completion. Bessel van der Kolk spent decades documenting what he called somatic storage. The way unprocessed emotion content doesn't dissolve, it gets held in the body. The body doesn't care what story you built around an experience. It only registers whether the experience actually moved through. So I can be sitting in perfect stillness on my cushion, and my body is still holding everything my practice helped me step over. And that's not failure of spirituality, that's just biology. Now here's where it gets more nuanced, because here's an obvious version of bypassing. The good vibes only, don't look at the shadow version. Most people in this space have moved past that. But here's the second layer, and this one is much harder to catch. So I noticed this in myself a few years ago. I was in a situation where someone active with me all the time, like triggering me badly. I found myself thinking maybe the environment isn't good for me. Maybe it's time to move on. Maybe I need to set boundaries here, because I genuinely don't feel good around someone who activates me like this. And look, that might all be true. Those might be completely legitimate conclusions. But I also noticed that I arrived at them very quickly, before I'd actually sat with what the activation was about. Before I'd let myself feel what was underneath it. The framing was different, more psychologically sophisticated, more like self-care than spiritual bypassing. But the function was the same. I used it to exit the feeling before it completed. And this is what Jung was pointing at when he wrote about the persona. The masks we build tend to become more sophisticated over time. In spiritual community, it often starts as high vibes only, but it can evolve into something that looks like discernment, like healthy protection, like emotional intelligence. I don't engage with low vibe energy, that's an early version. I'm learning to honor my boundaries and remove myself from situations that don't feel aligned. That can be a more evolved version of the same move. Not always, but sometimes. And the only way to know the difference is whether you actually feel the same first. And this is that specific moment I mentioned at the start. The one where bypassing happens while it's invisible. It's a moment right after activation. Something opens, something stings. Instead of staying with the opening, the move is to immediately reach for a frame, to interpret it, to give it meaning, to make a decision about it. The frame might even be correct, but it arrives too quickly to let the body complete what just started. And I want to be clear, this isn't about blame. Most people who do this learn to do it early, in environments where sitting with difficult feelings wasn't safe. Spirituality became somewhere to put the weight of things. That makes sense. That's a reasonable adaptation. The question, and it's not one I can answer for anyone else, is whether it's still what's happening. Groff's research on post-experiential integration and the clinical work that followed it keeps pointing to the same structural need. The contemplative work and the body have to happen together. And what that actually looks and feels like in practice, not in theory, is something I want to try to describe. There was a moment where I made a different choice. Instead of reaching for a frame, instead of finding a reason, or making a decision, or telling myself what it meant, I just stayed with it. And the first thing I noticed was the sensation in my stomach. This uncomfortable, almost nauseating feeling that I would normally have moved away from very quickly. I stayed with it, and it spread. The pain moved out from my stomach through my body. It became physical in a way I wasn't expecting, kind of shivering, and then it dissolved. What van der Kolk and Peter Levine's somatic research describe is essentially that process. The nervous system, when it's allowed to, knows how to complete what got interrupted. The issue isn't that we can't process. The issue is that we've learned to interrupt the processing at the exact moment it's about to do something. And the interruption often looks and feels like wisdom. That's the whole problem Wellwood was pointing at. If something in this is sitting uncomfortably, that's worth paying attention to. Actually, if a specific person came to mind while you were watching, that's really worth paying attention to. I made a video about exactly that, because what we just talked about and what triggers you in other people, those two things are usually the same conversation. It's on the screen now. If this resonated with you, a thumbs up, a comment, or a subscribe genuinely help a small channel like mine keep going. Thank you. See you in the next one.